right. It's a blessing to see each of you back in the house of God tonight, the last service of this series that we began on Sunday morning in Sunday school. And we're dealing this week with Bible apologetics in youth. As I said, as we began this series, we're very concerned about young people today. We're very concerned about the next generation. We desire to do everything we can to help disciple and prepare the next generations to face the things we have to face today. And all of the attacks upon the Bible that we see today are a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And men like Richard Dawkins, who is such a bold atheist, and the whole evolutionary theory and all of that really is evidence that the Bible is the infallible Word of God, because all of that was prophesied in the Scriptures thousands of years ago. And tonight we're going to look at archaeology. Amazing research has been done the last 150 years in the field of archaeology. In the first part of the 19th century, in the 1800s, very little was known about the ancient kingdoms that we read about in the Bible, such as Babylon and Assyria and Egypt. And there were some artifacts that existed, but nobody could read them. The ancient Babylonian language, no one in the world could read it. The ancient Egyptian language, no one could read it. And it wasn't until into the 19th century that those languages were broken and they could, again, read those languages. And an amazing amount of excavation began to be done all over the biblical world, Mesopotamia and Israel and Egypt. And all of that research, every bit of it, authenticates the Bible. Nothing that they have found has proven the Bible not to be true. But time and again, the critics have made statements against the Bible and said that the Bible's wrong time and again, time and again, time and again. And through their own research, they have been proven to be wrong, and the Bible has proven to be true. And that's what we're going to look at tonight, some examples of this. The Bible critics, even though they have been proven wrong so many times and so dramatically, most of them have not repented or even apologized. And the Bible tells us why. This is not an intellectual problem that men have who dispute the Bible. It is a spiritual problem. And unless there is repentance in the heart, nothing's going to change intellectually. And Abraham, Jesus told the account of the rich man and the poor man who died in Luke 16. And the rich man was speaking to Abraham from hell, and he wanted Lazarus, the poor man, to go back and witness to his brothers so they would get saved and they would not go to hell. And it's not a parable, it's a true account. In parables, Jesus never mentioned the names, proper names, personal names of people, but in this account, he gives the name of Lazarus and Abraham. And Abraham answered that rich man and said, no, if they will not hear the Bible, if they will not hear Moses and the prophets, if they will not hear the Scriptures, they won't believe even if somebody rises from the dead. It's a spiritual problem. So following some of the instances in which the Bible critics have been wrong. They've been wrong, number one, about ancient writing. Ancient writing. In the 19th century, it was believed by the modernists and the humanists that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, because writing was not known in his day. Robert Ingersoll, 1894. and this is way late into the 19th century. Robert Ingersoll was the infamous American skeptic. He said, these wanderers, Moses and Israel he's talking about, had no written language. They could neither read nor write. And that was what he was spouting off in his book called About the Bible. But secular archaeologists today know that that's absolutely wrong. And they've uncovered, since the 19th century, they've uncovered ancient libraries filled with books written in a plurality of languages, going all the way back to the 4th millennium, which is the time of Noah, the time of the flood, all the way back, these ancient writings, 1,500 years before Moses. And archaeology has proved that these ancient kingdoms that we read about in the Bible, such as Babylon and Assyria, were literate kingdoms. And they were full of schools and libraries, and they carried on, conducted international correspondence in multiplicity of languages. The evidence is everywhere. Ancient libraries have been unearthed at Ugarit and Mari and Ur, the birthplace of Abraham, Ebla, Nippur, Nineveh, Persepolis, many other places. You can go into major museums like the British Museum, and you can see on display just a few of these ancient writings going back to the time before Moses. Here's a few of them. In 1904, a very interesting book, The Monument, Facts and Higher Critical Fancies. And A.H. Sayce was showing that these modernists were wrong already in 1904. He said the Mosaic age, instead of being an illiterate one, was an age of high literary activity and education throughout the civilized East. From one end of the civilized ancient world to the other, men and women were reading, writing, and corresponding with one another. Schools abounded and great libraries were formed. Well, the critics were totally wrong. Totally wrong. Have they apologized? They never did. They should have hung their heads in shame. You see, those theories that Moses couldn't write and they couldn't read and write in those days were broadcast all over the world. Yet they never apologized. The critics were wrong also about Genesis 10. Genesis 10 is a very important chapter of the Bible, one of the oldest parts of the Bible, and it describes after the flood, what happened after the flood, and the dispersal of men according to Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And it's a very, very, very important historical document. And the Bible critics said, well, this is just a myth. This whole thing is just a myth. Genesis 10 and 11 describes the division of the nations by Noah's sons following the floods. It describes the establishment of city-states, powerful city-states, such as Babylon and Nineveh, and the building of the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of the languages. And the modernists said, well, that's just a bunch of religious myth. Again, Robert Ingersoll said, we only know that the books of the Pentateuch are filled with mistakes and contradictions. We also know that the account of the Tower of Babel is an ignorant and childish fable. And yet the skeptics have been proven wrong through their own research. Henry Rawlinson, one of the famous early archaeologists from England, and he's one of the ones that unlocked the Babylonian, Akkadian, or cuneiform languages. And he said that Genesis 10 deserves to be called the most authentic record that we possess for the affiliation of nations. That was his conclusion after his research in the late 19th century. We have evidence for the cities named in Genesis 10. Here they are, Genesis 10, 9 through 11. And the beginning of his kingdom, it's talking about Nimrod. Nimrod, the son of Ham, was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth and Calah. And these cities are mentioned by name, and the Bible tells us that they were built not long after the flood, and there was a mighty leader and kingdom builder named Nimrod, and he apparently had an associate or a man closely associated with him named Asher. And Nimrod built Babel among other nations, and Asher built Nineveh among other cities. 7 cities are mentioned in Genesis 10 in association with these two kingdom builders. And 5 of these cities are known to archaeologists today as real cities in that very time, in that very place. They've unearthed the remnants of those cities, dating to the very time we read about in Genesis. The 5 cities are Babylon, Erech, it's also called Uruk, Nineveh, Calah, and Akkad, and it's spelled in a couple different ways. And the archaeologists know a lot about these ancient cities going back to the time of Genesis. They've affirmed that Akkad was a kingdom dating to the time after the flood, and the city of Akkad was the heart of the Akkadian Empire that was founded, they believe, by Sargon the Great. The Bible says it was founded by Nimrod. And it could be that they're the same man. But the archaeologists have concluded it was founded by Sargon the Great in the 3rd millennium BC, going back to the time of the flood. And that city gave its name to the language that was the international trade language in those ancient times. And most of those many of those old books, those old tablets that have been recovered from those ancient libraries are in the language that's named after the city that's here in Genesis 10 in the Bible, Mesopotamia. That language was used all the way up to the time of the Persian Empire, a few hundred years before Christ. We have evidence for the cities named in Genesis 10. We have evidence for the civilization described in Genesis 10, 11, 12. Archaeology has confirmed everything the Bible indicates about those ancient kingdoms. Archaeology confirms that at that very place and that very time, technologically advanced civilizations sprang up and spread across Mesopotamia. There where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow down to the Red Sea. And that very place, here's a book I purchased a couple years ago when I was visiting one of the museums in Chicago, archaeological museums. Here writing was invented and the beginnings of mathematics. Here, in that very place, in that very time where the Bible's talking about in Genesis 10 and 11. And the beginnings of mathematics, astronomy, and law, as well as important innovations in art and architecture. That's one of the latest books by the most advanced archaeologists alive today. 2 Yale University professors. Archaeology confirms the spread of these powerful city-states that the Bible is describing here in Genesis 10. The Bible is describing kingdoms, city-states that are the heart of kingdoms and alliances that they were forming. Archaeology confirms the spread of literacy and reading and writing. Archaeology confirms the multiplication of proud, deified rulers, Nimrod-type rulers. They called themselves titles such as King of the Totality. That takes a lot of audacity. Even Obama doesn't say that. Archaeology confirms the spread of the art of war by these powerful rulers. Nimrod was called a mighty hunter. He was a hunter of animals, and he was a hunter of men. He was a warrior. Archaeology confirms the spread of idolatry. And right in Genesis chapter 11, we read about the idolatry, the beginning of idolatry. That tower was an idolatrous structure. And Romans chapter 1 tells us what was happening there in that day, in Nimrod's day. Here's how Paul described it. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. They knew God. When they came off of the ark, men knew God. All of Abraham's family did. And then the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They knew God, knew about the true God. But they weren't thankful, but became vain in their imaginations. And their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. They weren't thankful. That's the beginning of idolatry. They simply weren't thankful to God. How many people in this land of bounty bow their heads and pray before their meals even? And they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like the corruptible man, and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. And idolatry was invented there in the days of Nimrod, the days after the flood, and spread all over the world. Archaeology confirms the moral corruption of society that attended the idolatry and that always attends idolatry. And Paul also described that in Romans 1. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. See, here's a goddess over on the right there, the picture, and the filthy immorality that attended the idols. Here are some reconstructions. These are very recent reconstructions of some of these ancient cities. I paid a lot of money in some cases to license these, to use them in my presentations. I licensed these from Archaeology Illustrated. Here's Eridu, about 2400 BC. That's back to the time near the flood. And these are not just figments of some artist's imagination. These are based on archaeological findings and what they know and can figure out how these cities look like. These were not just, mud brick walls and buildings and such. These were splendid, amazing cities. This is what Avaris in Egypt looked like about 1600 BC. We're all going back into the time of Genesis here for these cities. Here's what Ur of the Chaldees looked like at about 2100 BC, going back to the time about of Abraham a little before. Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham grew up. Here's the civilization that existed in Crete in very ancient times, and one of their major cities looked like. And Uruk, that's one of the cities mentioned in Genesis 10, about 2400 BC. And Mari, about 2100 BC. All of these are in Mesopotamia except the one in Egypt. Let's look more closely at one of these. Ebla. Ebla. Now, this city is not mentioned in Genesis, but it's one of the ancient cities that multiplied across Mesopotamia at that time. They found roughly 20,000 clay tablets at Ebla, and it's been a very rich archive of information about those times. Here's what the tablets looked like when they were found. It's a lot of work. Archaeology is just hard work, and it's a tedious work to be able to remove the tablets from the surrounding soil clay and clean them up so that you could read them. And these tablets were found in the ancient palace archives. Tabla was a kingdom encompassing more than 250,000 people. The capital city had 30,000 inhabitants. These were city-states. They were magnificent cities that were at the heart of a little kingdom, sometimes a large kingdom. The luxurious two-story palace occupied 28,000 square feet. The walls were 40 to 50 feet high all the way around the palace. Ebla as a kingdom encompassed 16 governorships. They carried on, conducted business estimated in the billions of dollars a year in today's money. Fabulously rich little kingdom. That was just one of the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. They traded in grain, cattle, timber, textiles, beautiful handicrafts. They made vessels, military equipment, all sorts of things. Beautiful jewelry. They worked in metal, made all sorts of things in metal, including alloys of bronze by mixing copper and tin, very complicated process. Ebla owned an estimated 2 million sheep, 500,000 head of cattle. They grew enough barley in 1 year to feed millions of people. So they had a large excess for export. Here, Ebla traded to the south with Lebanon, Canaan, and Egypt. Ebla traded to the west in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey region. Ebla traded to the east across the Mesopotamian region as far as the Persian Gulf. And so Ebla did business. This is all determined from those tablets that they uncovered and read. She did business with 1,000 cities and towns and 80 kingdoms. That's an amazing little city-state. And just one of them, to just give us a little idea of what was happening in those days, in the days of Abraham and Moses and these people. Ebla was a literate society. Her scribes were proficient in multiple languages. She carried on international correspondence in multiple languages. They found bilingual dictionaries. She had a powerful military with as many as 12,000 men under arms at one time. She was devoted to idols, filthy idolatry. Here's a goddess over on the right. Ebla's tablets mention the gods, the idols, in the Bible. It mentions Baal, they mention Chemosh, and they mention Dagon. Dagon, the god of the Philistines. The critics have been proven in regard to Genesis 10 and 11 totally wrong. Totally wrong. William Albright, another very famous pioneer archaeologist, said the Table of Nations, he's talking about Genesis 10, remains an astonishingly accurate document. Astonishingly accurate indeed. That's not a Bible believer. That's just an archaeologist talking about the evidence. And we've dealt a lot with this, very extensive with this whole subject about the ancient kingdoms and the technological marvels that they had, and kingdoms such as Ur of the Chaldees in our series on Bible times and ancient kingdoms. The critics were wrong about Genesis 14. Genesis 14. So we're still in Genesis. And they're basically saying in the 19th century, well, they still do, in fact, because in spite of the evidence, they're still spiritually blind. But they were saying that all of these things are myths. This is religious myth. It's not accurate history. In Genesis 14, we read about a military alliance of 4 kings that came down from Mesopotamia and traveled down to the southern part of Canaan, and to the southern part of Canaan, to the southern end of Jordan River, and attacked 5 kings led by Sodom and Gomorrah. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Eleazar. Now, Shinar was up in Mesopotamia. Shinar is another name, in fact, for Mesopotamia, but there was also, and so there was a king that called himself the king of Shinar. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. Tidal, king of nations. That these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Edma, and Shemibar, king of something, Zeboam, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And these kings were just north of the Dead Sea, probably, where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea. This account was considered mythical, and they did not believe that there was any such movement of kings and military in those days, in that kind of ancient times. In fact, William Albright was convinced that all of this was a legend. And when he began his archaeological career, that's what he believed. It's all a legend. One reason was that Genesis 14 indicates that these kings came down from the north and came along the east side of the Jordan River down to the Dead Sea to make their attack. And the modernists were saying there was no highway over there. There was no way for the kings to march down along that side. But in 1929, Albright himself discovered that ancient highway. It was called the King's Highway. It ran along southwest from the Euphrates River to Damascus in Syria, from there down the east side of the Jordan and all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba in the Red Sea, from there over to Egypt. Here it is. See Mesopotamia there, the green at the top. That's where Babylon and Nineveh, Ur the Chaldees, those cities existed. And they came down through Syria, through Damascus, and down. And there was an ancient highway there, and the archaeologists know that today. Have they apologized? No, they haven't apologized. The critics were wrong also about the ancient law codes. They said they said that Moses couldn't have had this complicated law that he wrote. Of course, we know that Moses wrote by divine inspiration. But the modernists, the naturalists, the skeptics were saying, well, nobody had any complex law codes like that in those days. And they said that to dispute the Bible. But then they discovered the Code of Hammurabi. They discovered the Code of Hammurabi. And this today is in the museum in France, in the Louvre. But it was found in the ruins of the palace of Shushan, the palace where Esther lived, where Nehemiah lived, Persian palace. But it had been brought to that palace from Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi. This is the original one at the Louvre here that I photographed. But they have copies in several museums, beautiful copies. The archaeologists date this law code to about 200 years before Moses. Totally explodes their position of that day, that the ancient people didn't have these complex law codes, because that's exactly what Code of Hammurabi is, an ancient complex law code. Code of Hammurabi documents the fact that those ancient men were highly illiterate, because it's all writing. At the top of the law code, at the top of Hammurabi, you have Hammurabi standing there, the King Hammurabi of Babylon, king of Babylon, and the sun god is sitting in the chair there, the throne. And then below that is the law code itself, the writing in the Akkadian language from the city of Akkad. And so here it is. It documents their literacy. It documents the fact that these ancient people had complicated law codes. We know that Moses got his from God, but still, this is totally 100% exploded their theory. Did they apologize? They did not apologize. And the critics were wrong about Ur. Oh, they were very wrong about Ur. They said Ur was a myth, a religious myth, that the birthplace of Abraham here that we read about in Genesis 12, 11 and 12, that it's never existed. But then in 1922, Leonard Woolley found a city of Ur, excavated it for the next 12 years. Amazing excavations that he did. And dug up a treasure trove of ancient artifacts dating from the time of Abraham and before. So the critics were proven wrong, and the excavations of Woolley showed that everything the Bible's saying about those ancient times were true. Ur was a sophisticated city, a literate city, an idolatrous city, a city with far-flung commercial enterprises, everything we would expect from reading the book of Genesis. We've already seen the artist's rendition based on the archaeological research, the artist's rendition of Ur. And see the temple there, see the tower there, the religious tower, where they worshiped the moon god in Abraham's days. There on the right side. Here's the Ur room at the British Museum. And they said Ur's a religious myth, and today we can go to the British Museum and see a whole room full of artifacts from ancient Ur. Have they apologized? They never apologized. The Ur craftsmen worked in metal, brilliant craftsmen. They fashioned beautiful jewelry. They had elaborate items of clothing. You can see the style that was popular among the women there. Beautiful pottery. They had a city drainage system. Here's Woolley and his wife standing down at the bottom of this drainage system that they had. They don't even have anything like this in Nepal today. Boats visited the city's harbor. This was the city on the Euphrates River. Busy commercial city. Ships came from long distances, as far away as India and Pakistan, coming down and coming up the Euphrates River. They had very high-tech methods of farming, agriculture. They used plows with the cedar attachment so they could plow and sow simultaneously, and they could control the depth of the planting of the seed. They had all kinds of complicated agriculture techniques. They had massive flocks of sheep and for meat and for the wool industry. They had beautiful musical instruments and harps that Woolley was able to recreate from what he found there, the remnants of what he found in the graves at Ur. Beautiful harps. It's a double clarinet. Ur had a powerful military, was very proud of her military. We know exactly what her soldiers looked like, how they dressed, what their equipment looked like, because they found actual pictures of these ancient soldiers of Ur. Here they are, in their robes and their helmets and their swords and their chariots. A team of 2 horses drawing these war chariots. One man driving the chariot, another man throwing spears and darts from the chariots. Here they are, they're running over the enemy soldiers. The city was devoted to idolatry, just like Romans 1 says. Just like Joshua says that Abraham's forefathers worshipped idols in Ur. They worshipped the moon god. They had a religious tower. They worshipped the moon god. Joshua 24:2. Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, the flood beyond Euphrates, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. And we today even know what their religious towers look like and what their little idols look like. You can go to the British Museum and see them. We're going to stop there for a few minutes, take our break.